Welcome to the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus program on ranked choice voting ballot question 2. We are recording this session and will post it on the MWPC.org website. My name is Pam Berman. I am the president of the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus. The Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus is a nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c3 organization. Our mission is to increase the number of women elected and appointed to political office. The ranked choice voting ballot question is important to the MWPC as it concerns ensuring that our voting system is fair, accessible, and raises the question of whether it will level the electoral playing field for women and diverse candidates. I want to thank one of our board members, Charlotte Golor-Ritchie, for organizing this forum on question 2. I also want to thank our MWPC program director, Einar Olmaz, for her work behind the scenes, as well as our 2 interns who are working on this program, Kashmir Flood and Alyssa Baer. I also would like to give a special thanks to our moderator, Representative Joan Moschino, and our panelists, Professors Daniel Allen and Jennifer Braceras, for participating. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator, my close friend, Representative Joan Moschino. Joan is in her 2nd term as a state representative. She represents the 3rd Plymouth District, which includes the communities of Cohasset, Hingham, Hull, and North Scituate. She's an experienced and qualified leader with a proven record of accomplishment that ranges from her leadership on the South Shore to advocacy for progressive causes across Massachusetts. Joan is a lifelong Hull resident. She served as selectman in Hull prior to becoming a state representative, as well as on many town boards and committees, regional boards, and statewide commissions. Joan is an attorney, a seasoned nonprofit executive and social justice advocate. She was the executive director of Mass Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, a public interest law center that promotes equal rights and opportunities for Massachusetts residents. Joan is the recipient of numerous awards and honors. She is also a MWPC PAC endorsed candidate. I will soon turn this program over to Joan, but before I do, I would also like to introduce you to the backgrounds of our 2 panelists. First panelist is Daniel Allen. She is the James Bryant Conant University professor and director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. She is a political philosopher, a public policy expert who focuses on democracy, innovation, health equity, justice reform, and education. She also directs the Safra Center's Democratic Knowledge Project, a K-16 civic education provider. Her books include Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality, Cause, an American Tragedy, and Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship Since Brown versus Board of Education. She has chaired numerous commission processes and is the lead author on influential policy roadmaps, including Pursuing Excellence on a Foundation of Inclusion, Roadmap to Pandemic Resilience, Getting It Done, Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century, and the forthcoming Educating for American Democracy, Excellence in History and Civics for All Learners K-12. She is a contributing columnist for the Washington Post, as well as writing for The Atlantic. She is a co-chair of the Yes on 2 campaign. Our other panelist is Jennifer C. Braceras. Jennifer is a lawyer, a columnist, and a political analyst. She currently serves as director of the Independent Women's Law Center, a project of Independent Women's Forum. I want to note that IW takes no position on Mass Question 2, and Ms. Braceras is here in her individual capacity. Jennifer is a graduate of Harvard Law School. She writes frequently about the issues at the intersection of law, politics, and culture. Her writing has appeared in a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe. Earlier in her career, Ms. Braceras practiced labor and employment law with the Boston law firm of Ropes and Gray, and taught courses on civil rights and constitutional law at Boston College Law School and Suffolk University Law School. Ms. Braziris is a former trustee of our alma mater, the University of Massachusetts, and a former member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. She serves on the board of Mass Fiscal Alliance, which opposes ranked choice voting. It is now my pleasure to turn this program over to our moderator. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and wonderful State Representative Joan Moschino. Thank you.
Co-chair of the Yes on 2 campaign. Our second panelist is, just one second, is Jennifer Braziris. She is a lawyer and a columnist and a political analyst, and she currently serves as the director of the Independent Women's Law Center, a project of Independent Women's Forum. I do want to pause and note for a moment, though, that IW takes no position on Massachusetts Question 2, and Ms. Braziris is here in her individual capacity. She is a graduate of law school. She writes frequently, Jennifer apologized. She is a graduate of Harvard Law School, which is quite impressive. She writes frequently about issues at the intersection of law, politics, and culture. Her writing has appeared in a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe. Earlier in her career, Ms. Jennifer practiced labor and employment law with the Boston law firm of Ropes and Gray, and taught courses on civil rights and constitutional law at Boston College and Suffolk University Law School. Jennifer is a former trustee of her alma mater, the University of Massachusetts, and a former member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. She serves on the board of Mass Fiscal Alliance, which is opposed to ranked choice voting. So why don't we start with Danielle as a proponent. Walk us through and we're offering each of our panelists an opportunity to frame the question for us. Why don't we start with our proponent, Danielle. Go ahead and walk us through what you're thinking and why you think we should consider ranked choice voting.
Thank you so much, Representative Moschino. I really appreciate your framing and very glad to be here talking with Jennifer. The people of Massachusetts deserve responsive, accountable government that reflects our rich diversity and that can deliver solutions to our challenges. Ranked choice voting can deliver this. Our current system, first past the post or plurality voting, doesn't. Currently, a Massachusetts voter picks just one candidate for each office on the ballot. On this system, people can take office even if they've received less than 50% of the vote. That is, they can take office even if the majority of voters actually oppose them. This undermines legitimacy and also the effectiveness of office holders and squelches the voices of voters. In contrast, ranked choice voting allows voters to rank all of the candidates running for a given office. You can pick your first, second, and third choice, and so on. There's no requirement to vote for someone you don't want. That's really important. Every ranking is a positive one for someone you might want to see in office. If a candidate wins a majority of votes on the first round, that's great. That's what we all want, getting over that 50% line. But if nobody wins that 50%, then the person who got the least votes is eliminated and their voters' votes are redistributed to the other candidates. In other words, if your first choice pick is still in the race, nothing changes. That's still where your vote goes. It's just the people who voted for the last person whose votes get reallocated in the second round of counting. So that process of rounds of counting continues until somebody has a pile of votes that gets above 50%. That means nobody can take office without carrying support from at least 50% of the voters with them. So that does increase legitimacy and means the voices of a broad coalition of voters are carried into decision making. Ranked choice voting also helps draw more voices into politics. The current election system favors established insider candidates with name recognition and support from wealthy donors. Voters very often hesitate to back outsider candidates, often women and people of color. They worry that supporting the outsider will hurt the candidate whom they view as the lesser of two evils among the more established candidates. And that's long been the plight of outsider candidates in primary elections and third-party candidates in general elections. But since the ranked choice system empowers voters to support multiple candidates for one office, voters can choose underdogs without feeling like they're throwing away their votes for someone with a slim chance of winning. That opens up space for more electoral competition, for more people to take the chance of running for office, which is a hard thing to decide to do. Ranked choice voting in Massachusetts will encourage candidates from a broader array of backgrounds to give it a try, and it will give voters the freedom to support them. So that will bring more voices into our politics and also increase responsiveness. In fact, there's research on 4 San Francisco Bay Area communities that have recently implemented ranked choice voting that found that this system did increase candidates of color from 17 to 25%. And it also increased the probability of a female candidate winning from 40 to 44%. That's a small increase, but still a meaningful increase in opportunity. In Maine, which adopted ranked choice voting in 2016, this summer's primaries had much higher turnout than in previous years. A 59% increase in the Republican primary in Congressional District 2 for them, and a 23% increase in the Democratic Senate primary. In other words, ranked choice voting has been consistent with drawing more voices into politics. It also reduces negative campaigning. Candidates want to win not just to be a person's first choice, they also want to be people's second and third choice. That makes them less likely to demonize their opponents since they're trying to pick up their opponent's voters. So candidates have to change how they approach campaigning. And indeed, there's research that shows that people living in ranked choice systems are happier. There's a Rutgers University survey that found that voters in the municipalities that used ranked choice voting had a memory of much less criticism. 53% of respondents recalled candidates criticizing each other, in contrast to 65% in cities where voters select only their first choice candidate. So ranked choice voting helps elections focus on the kind of problem-solving approaches that can attract support from a true majority. So here's what ranked choice voting gives us. Elections won with a true majority. Full expression of the voices of voters, a level playing field that can draw outsider and non-traditional candidates into public service, and more positive campaigns oriented toward problem solving and solutions that can actually garner majority support. Ranked choice voting offers all of these things. That's why I'm voting yes on 2.
Oh, Jennifer, thank you so much. And please always call me Joan. So I'd like to now turn to our other panelist, Danielle. Oh, excuse me, Danielle, I apologize. Thank you so much for your remarks. Please call me Joan.
No problem.
I'd like to now turn to our other panelist, Jennifer. Jennifer, you're not persuaded by this argument. Could you share with us your thoughts on question 2?
Sure. First, I just want to say, I think that Danielle makes some really good points. And I think that the ranked choice voting does have a lot of surface appeal. It's not a partisan issue. I think that's very important to say. There are Democrats and Republicans on both sides. I'm an independent, but I lean conservative Republican. And so honestly, you know, from the perspective of a conservative who maybe doesn't particularly like President Trump, if we were to have a ranked choice voting system at a national level, that would in some ways be a very attractive system, because you could vote libertarian, for example, and sort of be true to your principles, but then maybe put Trump second and not feel like you're actually voting for him, but you're not throwing the election to Joe Biden either, right? So it certainly would give the Libertarian Party a little bit more of a chance, and it would definitely allow people to vote, you know, to vote their conscience instead of voting for what they might regard as the lesser of two evils. But despite that surface appeal, I think that ranked choice voting is actually a wolf in sheep's clothing. And the reason is simply because it's just much more complicated than it sounds. It's not as simple as saying, I'll have a chocolate ice cream cone, and if they're out of chocolate, I'll take vanilla. And if they're out of vanilla, I'll have mocha or then coffee. But definitely don't give me the pistachio, because I hate that. Okay? Ranked choice voting requires voters to have a level of knowledge about all candidates that the truth is most people simply don't have. Even sophisticated voters, for example, in the recent congressional elections, only had information about a couple or a handful of the candidates out of the many who were running. Often voters know they really like candidate A, and they might know they really dislike, for example, candidate E, but they might not know much of anything at all about candidates B, C, and D. So asking people to rank them is a little like asking a customer who's never tried mocha or coffee to rank those flavors in their choices. Now, you could say that ranked choice voting encourages voters to do their homework, to try all the flavors, if you will, and that this would be good for democracy. And frankly, I would agree. The reality is that's not going to happen. Most voters, as I said, even very sophisticated voters, won't take the time to do this or simply don't have the time to do this. But even assuming for the sake of argument that voters are operating with full information about, say all 9 candidates, very few voters are sophisticated enough to strategically rank the candidates to maximize their actual preferences. And that's because it's not as simple as if there's no chocolate, you get to have vanilla. The way the distribution process works, it's possible that by ranking a flavor you like second or third, you're actually knocking out your first choice pick. So that by even ranking mocha or coffee at all, you end up knocking out chocolate in the long run. And frankly, without a degree in game theory, it's often very hard to know that ahead of time. I wrote a column for the Boston Globe where I gave sort of this very simple example. Let's say you're a voter in the presidential primary, the most recent presidential primary on the Democratic side, and you favor Joe Biden. But Elizabeth Warren wins the most votes in Massachusetts because it's her home state. So say she wins 40% of the vote, Biden wins 20% of the vote, including your vote. Sanders gets 15% and everybody else gets 25% divided amongst them. If Sanders receives a large number of second, third, fourth, and fifth place rankings from voters who chose candidates that finished at the bottom, he could, through the redistribution process, end up with more votes than Biden. And in this scenario, the third place Sanders would eliminate the second place Biden from the race, requiring that Biden's voters be redistributed to Sanders and Warren. If enough Biden voters preferred Sanders to Warren, Sanders could win the primary, even though 85% of the voters chose somebody other than Bernie Sanders, and even though Sanders might not have even been the second or third place choice of a majority of voters. Now, if that sounds complicated, it's because it is. And voters need to think not just about the order of preference when they rank candidates, but they need to try to figure out strategically which of the candidates are likely to beat the others and who will be the last 2 candidates standing. The simplest way to describe it, I think, is that it creates a series of closed door runoffs that require the voter to anticipate the last candidates standing. So because voters won't have enough information about all the candidates, and because they don't have the bandwidth to think strategically about their rankings, in many cases, they will look to others to tell them how to rank the candidates. So they might look to friends, or they might look to union leaders or political parties or special interest groups to tell them how to rank. And what I imagine will happen is a lot of these groups will start putting out cards that you should do it in this way. If you really favor so-and-so, this is the way you should rank your candidates. And the rankings might not actually reflect the true voter preference the way that a single vote does. I am certainly appreciative of the fact that some of our candidates don't always cross that 50% threshold, and that feels, somehow, in some ways, illegitimate in our democracy. But I would remind you that, for example, we've had many plurality presidents and candidates and office holders who, many of us may have really liked. Abraham Lincoln barely got 40% of the vote. Bill Clinton was a plurality president. John F. Kennedy was a plurality president. So, it's not necessarily a bad thing at the federal system. It's moderated by the Electoral College, and that's a whole separate issue. At our level, it could be moderated by a runoff election. So what we could do is say, if somebody doesn't cross the 50% threshold, we're going to have a runoff election between the top 3 vote getters. And what that would do is it would allow voters to come back and in real time decide, okay, as between these 3 candidates or these 2 candidates, which one do I like the best? Maybe I liked Joe Biden the best, but he's not in it anymore. So as between Warren and Sanders, who do I like?
Well, let's turn it back over to Danielle and ask her about that theory of change. Danielle, I think Jennifer's making some real arguments about why things have worked well so far, and really in terms of the math, and it might have a sort of a reverse effect or an unintended effect. Do you want to talk to us about what your theory of change is around that idea of a plurality versus a true a consensus majority?
Thank you, Joan. Let me start where Jennifer ended. She acknowledged that when people win with less than 50%, it feels illegitimate. I would say it actually also is illegitimate. Democracy depends on being of, by, for the people, and a true majority is an important founding block, cornerstone for legitimacy, not just feelings of legitimacy, but actual legitimacy. And it supports effectiveness in governance. People can govern more effectively when they carry that full majority with them. Now that's important once we accept that majorities matter in that way, because then Jennifer's next point was, well, yes, maybe you do need runoffs if we haven't gotten to that 50% point. Absolutely, exactly. And then the question is, what's the most efficient way of doing a runoff that maximizes participation? And ranked choice voting, also sometimes called instant runoff, is much more efficient than in-person runoffs, where participation declines dramatically with each round of voting. So this is really an important point. And then that leads us to focus on whether or not a ranked ballot provides more or less information than a single choice ballot. A ranked choice ballot provides more information about voter preference. There's not a person anywhere who would disagree with that. What is happening with a ranked choice ballot is you're getting actually 2 kinds of information: positive preferences and intensity of preference. So when Jennifer says, oh, well, then you'd have a result where 85% of people voted against Sanders, and look, he turns out to be the winner, that's actually a misrepresentation of the facts. What in fact happened is that a majority of people affirmed Sanders as a positive choice. They did so, though, with different levels of intensity, so it came through in total. Biden, in her story, didn't actually pick up additional votes. There weren't more votes to add to his pile. So in fact, the person with more votes ended up crossing the majority line in her picture, and that's the result. And that is what a runoff is supposed to deliver for you. That is what ranked choice voting delivers for you, in a method where just the last person is eliminated, the votes are recounted. So if you have voted for one of the top 2 people as your first choice, your vote always just stays for that person. It's the folks who ended up picking as their first choice somebody at the bottom whose votes get reallocated. It does not take strategic voting to do this. You can rank in your genuine order of preferences. But there's an important point here about voter education I'd really like to underscore, all right? Our voter education depends fundamentally on our campaigning. When you don't have to win a majority, you have a job in campaigning of just identifying exactly the people you want to turn out for you, and maybe it's enough to get to that 22% as in our recent congressional election. And then you actually kind of want to work to be keeping other people from even turning out, all right? So the way voter education works right now is we actually minimize the useful information voters can have. Whereas if a candidate needs to get past 50%, they need to build a coalition, and they're going to be advertising and communicating to more people than they would now. So every voter is going to be getting more educational materials. And the truth is, I have confidence in the voters of Massachusetts. I have confidence in elderly voters. I have confidence in people without college degrees. I have confidence in low-income voters. And indeed, their participation in ranked choice voting is very much in evidence and effective in the research that we've seen from the Bay Area as an example.
So I'm going to push back on you just a little bit. I really am curious to why you think that there'll be more information available to voters. I think that the point you make, and being a candidate myself, it takes energy, it takes a real skill set to put yourself out there and to create a platform, and there's a myriad of ways that we actively get out there. But yet you seem to think that somehow this is going to change how much information there is or isn't out there. I can tell you as a candidate, that's all you're about, is getting the information out there. So talk to us a little bit about, that sort of tension between the campaign and the candidate's responsibility for getting information out there and how people receive it.
I actually don't think that the candidates are going to try any harder than they're already trying. I do concede that I think it will, in many cases, reduce negative campaigning. Because you'll have situations like you have in Maine right now, where the Green Party candidate is saying, vote for me and vote for the Democrats second. So they're not going to be attacking each other. That's true. That's a favorable point. But again, the voters aren't going to necessarily make any more of an effort. And I consider myself an extremely sophisticated voter, right, as far as these things go. I love politics. I follow it closely. I have a law degree, and I'll be honest with you, when I went to vote in the third, and because I'm independent, I could vote in the Democratic primary. I knew who I liked in that primary, and I knew who I didn't like, and there were a bunch of people in between that I didn't know too much about, even the day, right up to the day when I went. And I'm not putting anybody down and saying, that certain groups of people aren't going to be able to figure it out. I'm saying all of us are going to be, overwhelmed by our lives, as we always are, and we're going to have a limited capacity for educating ourselves.
Danielle, what do you think about that?
I disagree. It's not true to my own experience and my own participation of ranked choice in ranked choice elections. But more importantly, I think it's important to recognize what Jennifer just described is she maximized her power on the existing voting system. She got just enough information to do her first choice vote, and that was all she needed to do. So that was an efficient response on her part. If voters choose to do that in a ranked choice system, and of course they can choose to do that, they're actually not maximizing their own power. And I believe the incentive of maximizing your power by having a second choice and having a third choice will motivate voters to get the knowledge they need to be able to rank a good way down the ballot. I'm not saying that voters will learn how to rank, say, all 9 candidates, but I'm sure that it's well within people's capacity to figure out who their top 4 are, their top 5. And typically that is sufficient number of rounds for the runoff system to have that vote be operating all the way down if in their first choice they pick somebody who turns out to be at the bottom. And again, I think the point about campaigning is important. And I want to just actually quote Jake Auchincloss, who is an endorser of Yes on 2. So he won, and he wishes he could have won with a majority, that he could go to Washington, presumptively, if he wins the next round, not having to worry about fixing fissures and cracks. And he's very, very explicit about the change in campaigning that this would require. He says, in his experience now, what you're taught to do in campaigning is to drive wedges. He needed that 22%. And so your goal is to sort of fragment the electorate and find the part that best fits you and turn them all out and direct your information work there. In ranked choice voting, you have to build a coalition. You've got to figure out what's that 51% of voters that you can carry with you. And you've got to get your information to all of them and pull them together. And so that is an incentive structure that will lead candidates to deliver information in different ways to voters. I'm not saying ranked choice voting is going to fix every problem we have. No, of course not. We have a magnitude of problems. But it will encourage an approach to campaigning that supports voter education, empowers voters to fully express their voice, providing more information about the full range of their preferences.
I guess my view is, there are pros and cons to every system. And our current system isn't perfect, and ranked choice voting isn't perfect. But in order to, I think, convince people to make a change, I think you have to convince them that the ranked choice voting system is going to be better. And it's not that I don't see that there are some very positive aspects of it. I just don't think that those positive aspects outweigh the negative aspects. And I would argue that it doesn't actually, well, 2 things. One is, what happens when you really, really dislike some candidates on the ballot and don't want to give them your vote at all. You don't want to rank them at all. You don't want to endorse them.
Don't rank them.
Right.
Don't.
So
Right.
what happens then,
That's,
let me finish, is that
Let him finish.
often those, when you don't fill out the entire ballot and rank everybody, your ballot can become exhausted and discarded if the people you do put down aren't in the top 2 vote getters in the final round. And so unlike a runoff where you would then have a chance to come back and decide between those 2 candidates, your vote has been exhausted. And what that leads to is faux majorities, where the person who ultimately wins may have a majority of the ballots that are counted, but thousands of other ballots have been discarded. And that happened in Northern California, where the winner of this municipal election had 4,000 some odd votes, and there had been over 9,000 ballots discarded. So the person had a majority, but a majority of what? Not of actual voters.
Well, don't we already do that now in local elections? There'll be 2 seats up, you can vote for 2 people, and oftentimes people understand that sometimes not casting the vote can be equally powerful. Jennifer, I mean, do you think that that plays in here at all?
may I respond
Yes, I
to
do.
her
And
point?
that's not a
first?
perfect system either, but I'm saying this exacerbates that because people don't necessarily realize if they only vote for 3 out of 9 candidates, they don't necessarily realize that their vote isn't going to count and that they don't get to participate in that final instant runoff.
Danielle, you start to respond?
Thank you, and I appreciate that. So Jennifer's point about the importance of having runoffs all the way down is key, but it's not a hypothetical. We know what happens in real life when we have a runoff where if you've gotten literally down to that 6th or 7th round, the participation drops way off. So at that last round, it will be a low number of votes. In fact, it will be a smaller number of votes based on the existing data than the number of votes that are still active and making the evaluation the full count for the runoff in the ranked choice system.
And that is true. That is true. But then it's your choice. It's your choice not to participate in the final runoff if you don't go. Whereas with ranked choice voting, you haven't really, I think, knowingly agreed to that. That's
so I'd like to, oh, sorry, Jennifer. I'd like to change it up a little bit. Obviously, we have the pandemic right now, and we've started to make some changes to our system. And I'm interested to hear what both of you have to say about the fact that we're doing mail-in voting and we're doing early in-person voting now. Jennifer, I'm just curious, does that change the equation for you? Does that change in the system give you a reason to consider ranked choice voting?
No, it doesn't affect me either way. I mean, I'm opposed to early voting, frankly, because, look at all the things that have happened this week, even in the past 10 days on a national scale, right? Anything can happen leading up to election day. I mean, the president of the United States could get COVID and potentially die, right? And people have already started voting. So I really believe that ballots need to be cast in real time on the basis of things that are happening within a 2-day period maximum.
Danielle, what do you think about that?
Sure, no, thank you. So just first an observation that on the very specific question of do people prefer ranked choice voting or runoffs, that specific reform, 170,000 people have signed petitions here in Massachusetts to put RCV on the ballot. They haven't done so for runoff elections. So that is one indicator of where people's choices are. For your broader question, I'd like to sort of zoom out a little bit to the work of the commission I was fortunate to serve on, the American Academy's Commission on the Future of the Practice of Democratic Citizenship. We spent a lot of time thinking about voting mechanisms and structures in that report. And in general, one of the things that we focused on was ways of making voting easier with the goal of empowering people, making sure voting was fully accessible. So in that regard, we do think in this emergency context, and we are very specific to limit it to this emergency context, mail-in voting is key and critical. More broadly, in general, beyond the emergency context, we also advocate automatic voter registration and early voting and voting centers. So voting should be easy. We also think we should recognize it as a civic duty. So we also argue for the federal election being on a national holiday, ideally Veterans Day, Some people serve in the military. We should all serve our country. And one of the ways we can serve is by voting. So we produced a package of recommendations that are about easiness of voting and recognizing our duty to vote. Ranked choice voting was in the mix.
I would be 100% in favor of a holiday for voting where it didn't occur on a work day. We can agree.
We'll sign you up
I
for
think
that.
that's a
We'll work
great
on that.
idea. Here. I will file that bill for you.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, that's exciting. Oh, great. Let's do it.
Absolutely. Obviously, we are being hosted tonight by the Mass Women's Political Caucus. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask both of you what you think the link that ranked choice voting does or doesn't have to gender, to race, to inclusion. I'll start with you, Danielle, because you talked a little bit about trying to have more diversity of a candidate pool.
Well, what ranked choice voting does is make it much more realistic for a third candidate to take a crack at it. Okay, so in other words, right now it's very, very hard for somebody to want to come in and be, get shamed as a spoiler candidate, or to come in with less money out of the gate into a race. And so what ranked choice voting does is make it reasonable for people to undertake the hard effort. It really is hard. I mean, Rep. Mosquito, what you do, putting yourself forward to run for office, that's a hard choice for people to make. And ranked choice voting opens up the spectrum of possibility enough that it will draw more people in, as we've seen in the research coming out of the Bay Area.
But you have to say why. How is it more
because
attractive?
you have a chance, because you actually have a chance of winning, and you won't be shamed as a spoiler. And that means it's reasonable to put yourself on the line, because you might actually win. It's not impossible. And again, you won't be subject to the sort of rhetoric of a person who is sort of splitting the vote, say, of the Democrats or splitting the vote of the Republicans. You can make your case. And so I think that's the other really important thing to say, is that it opens up space for more voices to be heard in the agenda of an election. And that too changes the dynamic for responsiveness, because it then means whoever's elected has a bigger set of arguments that have been made in the election that they have to carry with them as they think about what their agenda of governance will be.
Jennifer, what do you think about that?
Well, I think the parties have to take responsibility to some extent. I think that they have, they should do a better job at recruiting female candidates, of recruiting candidates of color, and all of those things. And I think, the whole notion of a party, either party, Democrat, Republican, whatever, is that it's supposed to be a big tent, and it's supposed to be a coalition, and you're supposed to bring in all the voices. That's how it's supposed to work. So, in the Democratic presidential primary, Joe Biden might have gotten the nomination, but, he picks as his running mate somebody who also ran, somebody who might have been regarded as, having a weak chance to begin with, who might have been somewhat regarded as an outsider. And he has to take care to make sure that, for example, Bernie Sanders voters and Elizabeth Warren's voters, who are much more to the left of him, don't decide to stay home on election day. So he, that's at a national level, of course, but the whole notion of a party is that the ultimate candidate is supposed to take into consideration the views of the members of the party.
So I'm curious, as we're coming down to about quarter of, and there's been a few questions that have sort of come through the chat, which I think you've both sort of spoken to, this idea of gaming the system for one candidate over another, and thinking about the likeliest opponent. I think you've both spoken to that. And then another question about wouldn't you simply just rank the people you don't like as last? I'm just curious if you feel like you wanted to add more to either of those concepts. And Jennifer, I see you on the screen, so I'll ask you first.
But first, that's fine, because I was just talking.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I couldn't hear you. Sorry, and I apologize to all of you. I am without power, so I'm in a public space, which is why I'm wearing a mask. So I hope I have been able to hear me clearly enough. And it's very dark where I am, and I'm trying to do this on my phone, so I apologize. Jennifer, you were speaking. I did not hear you, please.
Oh, it's fine. I just wanted to give Danielle an opportunity if she wanted to jump in first.
Oh, go ahead, Danielle.
I'm sorry, now I've lost track of what the question was. Oh,
No, there were just a few
again, I'm
questions.
sorry.
There were just a few questions in the chat that they're to the back and forth we were having, the discussion around gaming the system and concerns about that. You know, how I think the point you were making before speaks to how people consider the information that's in front of them and use it. I just didn't know if you wanted to add anything more to
Sure.
the discussion since those questions came in.
Sure. No, I absolutely. I mean, I think an important thing to know about this is that a lot of people who really care about voting and about fair voting systems are endorsers of the yes on Proposition 2. So, for example, the League of Women Voters has endorsed Proposition 2. Mass Vote has endorsed Proposition 2. Common Cause, both Senators Warren and Markey, 87 members of our state legislature, as well as Representatives, Catherine Clark, Representative Presley, our former governors Deval Patrick and Bill Weld, to Jennifer's point about it's not being partisan. And to the point about parties, I think Jennifer made an important point where she said, for example, it would give some space for the Libertarian Party in national politics. There is a sense in which what ranked choice voting does is open up space so that the question of what the role of the parties is up for debate a little bit, right? That it's not necessarily the case that it's a kind of clear sort of duopoly, so to speak. But that competitiveness in our politics would be good for responsiveness in our political institutions.
Jennifer?
Well, I think to the point about gaming the system, I guess people will always try to do that. And to the part of the question that dealt with whether you have to rank everybody, just put the people you don't like last. Some people are going to find certain candidates so repugnant that they don't want to endorse them at all. That's always going to happen. It's always going to happen. So then those people, run the risk of having their ballots exhausted again. So, I would just say that. I mean, there's also bipartisan support on the other side, right? I mean, I'm a conservative, but this measure has been vetoed twice by two California governors, Gavin Newsom and Jerry Brown. And the reason they vetoed it, or the reason they said they were vetoing it, was because they were concerned that overly complicated voting and denied access to English language learners, senior citizens, because the ballots are somewhat complicated. And actually here is a ballot, if you can see this, from Maine. And this is an example of a ballot that was marked incorrectly. And you see a lot of this amongst elderly voters and amongst English language learners, like I said, and unsophisticated voters. There is more of a risk with ranked choice voting that you will overvote and therefore have your ballot discarded completely. And we saw in 2000 with the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach how a confusing ballot can really throw things into chaos and disarray. And the goal of voting, it should be simple, it should be clean, and it should be easy for everybody to access. So I think for that reason, it's not worth making a change at this point. It's not that I don't acknowledge some of the problems that Danielle identifies. I'm not sure that this is the best way to deal with them. We've talked about runoffs as another possibility, but there's another system of voting too. I forget what it's called, affirmative voting, I think, where you can just put a yes by everyone you like without ranking them at all. It's a much less complicated system. It doesn't involve sort of the algebraic redistribution of votes. And then you just count up the votes and see who has the most. That would be another way of slicing the same problem. So there are a lot of ways to kind of get at this. I'm just not sure ranked choice voting, I worry that it creates more problems than it solves.
So it's 6:50 and we're starting to come to the end of our program. I was going to offer both of you just a minute or two to make a final sort of statement. That kind of sounded like you did, Jennifer, but let me just stay with you for a moment. And
Sure.
Is there like a concluding statement that you'd like to make, or anything you'd like to add to what you just said now?
Sure. I mean, I would just summarize by saying, no voting system is perfect. They all have advantages and disadvantages. The question for me is whether the advantages of ranked choice voting outweigh the disadvantages. And I believe that it's complicated, that it leads to voter confusion, that it leads to computerized runoffs where not all voters get to participate if their ballots have been exhausted. It ends up creating faux majorities and sometimes can create some sort of bizarre results. And ultimately, it's not as transparent as, you know, binary choices where the ballots are counted at the precinct level and recounts can be done under the watchful eye of the public in a way that is understood. You just count them.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. It was very articulate. And now I'll turn to Danielle and offer you just a few minutes to make a final summary before we turn it back over to our host, Pam Berman.
Sure, no, thank you very much. I do need to just clean up a few very specific facts. So both Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom are against plurality voting. California chose a top two system as their way of putting aside plurality voting. So it's true that they have not adopted ranked choice, but they did pick a different method for addressing the same problem. So they agree with the criticisms of plurality voting that I've articulated. Our two governors, Patrick and Weld, also endorse ranked choice voting. They also agree we should put aside plurality voting. Maine's voters successfully completed their ballots. 99-point-something% successfully completed their ballots this past summer. So we are not actually seeing voter confusion in practice in ways that are different from in any other kind of context of voting. So where does that leave us? Ranked choice voting will not solve all our problems. What will it do? It will meaningfully increase opportunity, diversify the field of candidates, empower voters to fully express their voices. In that regard, it will give us a sturdier foundation for the legitimacy of our political institutions.
Well, I just want to thank you both. Very interesting, and it's always wonderful to be on a panel with intelligent women who can really articulate the issues so incredibly well. I think you've really both sort of framed it in terms of the choices that we have to make now as voters. And, you know, I guess we'll find out soon enough because it's up to the voters right now to decide. Pam, I'm gonna end us there on a positive note and turn it back to you to wrap us up for tonight.
Thank you so much, Joan, and thank you to the panelists. A special thank you to everyone who tuned in. I want to say that as a small token of our appreciation, we are giving each of our two panelists a 1-year free membership in the Mass Women's Political Caucus. Please, to everyone who tuned in, remember to vote by mail, by absentee ballot, or in person. The election is on Tuesday, November 3rd. Please consider making a donation and joining the Mass Women's Political Caucus at MWPC.org. Thank you for your time and your attention, and good night.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you, everyone.